The Dayspring from on high hath visited us, to give light unto them that sit in darkness and in the shadow of death, to guide our feet into the way of peace. Dayspring is an effort to be in touch with good people who love God and who believe that the Bible is His Word. Dayspring is brought to you by your neighbors from Churches of Christ in this area. And now, visit with us as we draw near to God.
We're glad you're with us today. Thanks for coming our way. It is a sincere pleasure to have this opportunity to visit with you. And we delight in knowing that good people like you enjoy reading the Bible. Today we shall entertain a question that has come to us from our viewing audience. Bible question. There's no better way to study the Bible than to ask questions. We discover that a question that's asked by one individual will prove to be of great interest to numbers of other people as well. So you can send us a Bible question. We'll try to use it on Dayspring. You will notice as we visit together there is a telephone number on the screen. That telephone number is toll-free. It's for your use. You can call and leave a Bible question, and you do not need to talk to anybody. You can leave it as a recording. There's no fee for that. Absolutely no obligation. You've been good to send us questions through the months, and I'm asking you to continue to do that. We know what you're thinking, and that way we can talk about things from the Bible that are of greatest interest to you. Not only is there a phone number, but there's also a post office address. You can put something in the mail to me, and we'll get it. It'll come to our attention. And we'll use that question here on Dayspring. Now, our question for today's consideration. The question that has been submitted reads this. What was the name of the church in Jerusalem? There's the question. What was the name of the church in Jerusalem? A good question, thought-provoking, and it opens up avenues for us to think. What was the name of the church in Jerusalem? Well, first of all, let's turn to the Bible and see if that will help us some with this question. Acts chapter 5. If you'd care to turn and read with us, Acts chapter 5, and in that setting, verse 11. Here's what it says. Great fear came upon all the church, and upon as many as heard these things. What church is that? That's the church that was in Jerusalem. And it is referred to as the church. Great fear came upon all the church. Well, that doesn't help us much as far as the name is concerned. So let's turn again in our Bible to the 8th chapter of Acts and read what that passage says along these same lines. In Acts chapter 8, at verse 1, Luke's record says, And Saul was consenting unto his death, and at the time there was a great persecution against the church which was at Jerusalem. And they were scattered abroad throughout all the regions of Judea and Samaria. There was a persecution which arose against the church which was at Jerusalem. Well, that tells us where the church is located, and that we already knew. And it simply says it was the church located there at Jerusalem. That doesn't help us much. The question still is, what was the name of the church at Jerusalem? Let's read a little further. In verse 3 of Acts chapter 8, the text says, And Saul, as for Saul, he made havoc of the church, entering into every house, and dragging men and women committed them to prison. He made havoc Saul, later to become Paul, he made havoc of the church. What church, Paul, are we talking about? Well, the church at Jerusalem. That's what is referenced in that text. But we still don't know its name, do we? It's called the church that's located at Jerusalem. So let's read a little further. Over in the 11th chapter of Acts, at verse 22, hear this reference. Then tidings of these things came unto the ears of the church which was in Jerusalem. The church at Jerusalem received news about the beginning of a church in Antioch. That news came to the ears of the church. The church had ears. That, of course, is symbolic language. News reached this church. What church? Well, the church at Jerusalem. That's what that text says. The ears of the church which was in Jerusalem. Do we know its name? No, I guess not. Not at this point, because all that's said about that reference is that it was the church in Jerusalem. Maybe something else can help us as we continue to read. In Acts chapter 15, we're in Jerusalem again, and we are talking about that church. Verse 4 in Acts 15. Paul and Silas and a certain Paul and Barnabas and a certain group of other people, it said, when they were come to Jerusalem, they were received of the church and of the apostles and elders, and they declared all things that God had done with them. Paul, Barnabas, visiting with that church, sharing the good news that the gospel had been received in many other places through the preaching of Paul and Barnabas. And the text says, when they were come to Jerusalem, they were received of the church. Doesn't say what name it has, does it? There's no name attached to that. It's just referred to as the church in Jerusalem. Later in that 15th chapter of Acts, while they're still in that church, at verse 22, the Bible says, then pleased it the apostles and elders with the whole church to send chosen men of their own company to Antioch with Paul and Barnabas. The whole church. It pleased the whole church to send some men back to Antioch with Paul and Barnabas. And by the way, to write that church in Antioch a letter. Paul and Barnabas and those other men delivered that letter to the church in Antioch. Do we know the name of the church in Jerusalem? Well, that verse just says the church sent a letter, sent men to Antioch. No name attached to it, just called the church. There it is. And later on, we find other references to this same organization. In fact, there are some English translations of the scripture who sometime, instead of calling it the church, call it the congregation. The congregation at Jerusalem. Does that help us any? Not insofar as the name is concerned. We're still asking, what is the name of the church at Jerusalem? Well, sometime, as we've been reading, our English translations use the word church. Sometime the word congregation is translated by that word. The congregation at Jerusalem. And on occasion, an English version of our scriptures will use the word assembly. The assembly in Jerusalem. Please keep in mind that in all of these references, there is a reference to people. People make up this congregation of folks in Jerusalem. It's not a building. It's not just a piece of real estate. It's not a street address. It's people. The church in Jerusalem is the people who make it up. The word church is sometimes difficult to translate out of its original language into our English language. As you perhaps know, our New Testament, for the most part, was originally written in Greek. Translators took that Greek word and translated it into English. Quite often they did it by using the word church, sometime congregation, sometime assembly. The word church in Greek is a compound word, two words put together. The first part of that word means out of. The second part of that word means to call. Literally, the word church in the original language means to call out. Ecclesia refers to the called out people. So when reference is made to the church at Jerusalem, translated literally, the called out in Jerusalem, those people who had been called out of the world and into the service of Christ. An interesting thing, isn't it? Now here's something that might add to our study. About 200 years before Christ, the Old Testament, which was written originally, in the most part, in Hebrew, that Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek about 200 years before Christ. The Old Testament was translated into the Greek language. And there were certain words in that Hebrew Old Testament that were carried over into Greek by the same word we read in the New Testament, the called out ones, the ecclesia, the church, the assembly, or the congregation. Let's turn back to that Old Testament. Leviticus chapter 9 and verse 10. Deuteronomy chapter 9 and verse 10. Here's the reading. And the Lord delivered unto me 2 tables of stone, written with the finger of God, and on them was written, according to all the words which the Lord spake with you in the mount, out of the midst of the fire, in the day of the assembly. What Greek word do you suppose was translated assembly? It's that same Greek word that we have been reading, church. The assembly at the foot of Mount Hebron, the foot of the mount where Moses received the law, not Mount Hebron, at Sinai. Assembly is used to translate that Greek word into our English Bible. Later on in that same book of Deuteronomy, in chapter 16 and verse 16, there is another reference that is of interest to us. 3 times a year shall all the males appear before the Lord thy God in the place which he shall choose, in the feast of unleavened bread, in the feast of weeks, and in the feast of tabernacles. And they shall not appear before the Lord empty. Appear before the Lord. 3 assemblies. What word do you suppose is used to give us that meaning? It's the same word that's translated in the New Testament by the word church or congregation. The assembly back in that day, their church, if you please. Deuteronomy 31. Deuteronomy chapter 31 and verse 30, Moses spake in the ears of all the congregation of Israel the words of this song until they were ended. Moses spoke to whom? He spoke to the congregation of Israel. That's the word in our English. What word do you suppose appeared in the Greek, which was translated by the word congregation? It's that word, ecclesia, the called out ones. Here it's translated by the word congregation. And so, in Judges chapter 20 and verse 1, then all the children of Israel went out, and the congregation was gathered together as one man, from Dan to Beersheba, with the land of Gilead, unto the Lord in Mizpah. Later in that reading, and the chief of all the people, even unto all the tribes of Israel, presented themselves in the assembly. It's a congregation. It's an assembly. And that word that's translated for us in the New Testament by the word church, the church in Jerusalem, might well have been rendered the assembly in Jerusalem. It might well have been rendered the congregation in Jerusalem. The Jerusalem assembly, the Jerusalem congregation. There's the idea. Psalm chapter 22. In Psalm chapter 22 and verse 22, this prophetic statement, I will declare thy name unto my brethren in the midst of the congregation. It's translated from that same word, ecclesia, the congregation. And you know, in the New Testament, that Old Testament psalm is referred to in Hebrews chapter 2, where the Lord is pictured of saying, in the midst of the church will I sing thy praise. Rendered congregation here, rendered church over there. Same thing. The congregation in Jerusalem. The assembly in Jerusalem. All of that involved in the meaning, the name of the church in the city of Jerusalem. Acts chapter 7, verse 38. Stephen made reference to that Old Testament setting and said, this is he that was in the church in the wilderness with the angel which spake to him. The church in the wilderness, the congregation in the wilderness, the assembly in the wilderness, there it is. So what's the name of the church in Jerusalem? So far we have not discovered, have we? It's referred to as the congregation in Jerusalem. It's referred to as the assembly in Jerusalem, the church in Jerusalem, but no name is attached to it. Sometime in the Bible, in the book of Acts, in fact, this word, church, is used in a secular sense. Not just called out to God, but called out to an assembly of some kind. Acts chapter 19. In Acts chapter 19 at verse 39, here's an interesting reference. If you inquire anything concerning other matters, it shall be determined in a lawful assembly. There's a word, assembly, that is used in our text. Assembly is the same as the word church. So when it's used in a secular sense to refer to a body of people that have come together for some civic reason, it's also referred to as a church or an assembly. No name? We haven't discovered a name for that church in Jerusalem, have we? We've done a lot of searching, even in the Old Testament Greek. We've done a lot of searching, but there is no name that we found. Now, the truth of the matter is, in the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, in chapter 12 at verse 22, the New Testament speaks of the church of the firstborn. Is that a name? The church of the firstborn ones. Is that a name? It's a description. It's not a formal name. 1 Corinthians 14 and verse 33, Paul said, God is not the author of confusion, but of peace, as in all churches of the saints. Churches of the saints. Is that an official name? No, not hardly. It's a descriptive phrase. This church is made up of firstborn ones. It's made up of saints. Acts 20 and verse 28. Paul referred to the church as the church of God. Take heed therefore unto yourselves and all the flock over which the Holy Ghost made you overseers, to feed the church of God, which he purchased with his own blood. Is that the name? No, it's not a name. It's a description. It is a church that belongs to God. It is a church that was in God's plans all the way through Old Testament days. That's not the official name. Neither is the Church of the Firstborn an official name. Neither is the Church of the Saints an official name. We're still searching. Romans 16 and verse 16, Paul spoke of the churches of Christ. Is that the name? No, that's not the name. He's describing those churches as churches that belong to Christ. That's not the name that they're to officially wear. We sometimes read of the church in a local sense, as for instance in Galatians 1 and verse 22, Paul refers to the churches of Judea. Judea is a location. It is a province in which Jerusalem was located, more than one congregation there. The churches of Judea, that's not a name. That describes their location. In the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 16 and verse 1, reference is made to the churches of Macedonia. Macedonia is a large area, and there were many congregations in that area. And that reference, by the way, to the churches in Galatia, in Macedonia, is found in 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 1. The passage I had in mind in 1 Corinthians 16 and verse 1 refers to the churches in Galatia. The churches in that location. And so, in 1 Thessalonians chapter 1 and verse 1, the church of the Thessalonians, the church that was located in a city called Thessalonica, the church that was there, that was not a formal name. That was a description of where it's located. The same thing's true when we read of the church in Jerusalem. That describes where it's located. We still, my friend, have not found an official name. It's the church. It's the assembly. It's the congregation. But we haven't found an official name for it. Suppose there is none. That would make sense in light of the verses we've read. But now here's a local group of people, Christians. They are a congregation of God's people. They decide they want to buy a piece of property and perhaps build them a building on it as a meeting place. Now the state government says you've got to have an official name before you can title this property. An official name to put on the title. What shall it be? Well, just the church won't do, because that will not satisfy the legal requirements. This congregation now is forced as an expedient matter to put some name on that title. What name shall they put? Well, any name, as long as it does not violate what the Bible teaches. That's another way of saying, put some name on there that is mentioned in the Bible. So this property can be bought and titled in the name of the Church of God, the Church of Christ, the Church of the Firstborn, the Church of the Saints. None is an official name, but all are necessary to meet the requirements of the government. This church wants to borrow some money from a local lending institution. In whose name are they going to borrow it? Going to have trustees, and the trustees are going to borrow that money in the name of that church. Now, the lending institution will not accept just the church. That's too confusing. So again, those trustees are going to have a name in which to borrow that money. And so they're going to give a name to that lending institution, any name, not one specific name, but any name, as long as it's scriptural, as long as it's something we can find in the Bible. Otherwise, we may be creating confusion. Churches are tax exempt in many things. Churches do not pay income tax, for instance. In order to claim those exemptions, the government requires some name, not just a church. And there again, we may be called on to provide a name. Is that the name of the church? No. It is an expedient thing that satisfies the requirements of the government. Now, human names are very divisive. You wear one name, I wear another name, and that causes division among us. 1 Corinthians 1, verse 10, I beseech you, brethren, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that ye all speak the same thing, and that there be no divisions among you, but that ye be perfectly joined together in the same mind and in the same judgment. For it hath been declared unto me of you, my brethren, by them which are of the house of Chloe, that there are contentions among you. Now this I say, that every one of you saith, I am of Paul, I am of Apollos, I am of Cephas, I am Christ. Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified among you? Were ye baptized in the name of Paul? They were divided, and a part of their division was due to the fact that they were wearing different names. If we just go by what's in the Bible, we will prevent a great deal of that confusion and division among religious people. Of what church do you belong? I belong to the church which is mentioned in the Bible. Should that not suffice? The church in Jerusalem had no official name. It's referred to as the church, the assembly, the congregation. And that's where we should leave it when we're looking for a name for church today. It's been good to be with you. Thanks for being our guest. Until the next time, may the goodness of God be yours in full measure.
You've been watching Dayspring. Dayspring is brought to you by your friends in local area churches of Christ. To request a free CD of today's lesson, you may contact us at Dayspring, Post Office Box 453, Tupelo, Mississippi 38802, 0453. There is no cost for this offer. You will not be asked for financial support. You can also phone your request toll-free at 1-866-842-4139. Or you can go to our website at dayspringtv.com. Thank you for visiting with us on Dayspring.